The aviation landscape in Brazil has changed pretty dramatically over the last 20 years. In 2005, Brazil's three biggest airlines were Varig, VASP, and TAM. VASP shut down in 2005, and Varig went bust in 2006, and TAM was acquired by LAN Chile in 2012, leaving Brazil without a true flag carrier. Between 2006 and 2008, the industry was in crisis, and not only because airlines were going out of business, but because the aviation infrastructure as a whole appeared to be outdated and ineffective. The crash of Gol Flight 1907 in 2006 exposed issues with air traffic control, while the crash of TAM Flight 3054 in 2007 exposed potential issues with pilot training, airport upkeep, and aircraft maintenance procedures. So over the last 2 decades, Brazil has invested billions to upgrade its aviation infrastructure and build new airports to accommodate growth in passenger volumes. Simultaneously, a new wave of airlines emerged to make air travel more affordable and accessible. None of these airlines would carry the same prestige as Varig, but they did have the effect of dramatically increasing access to flying, especially domestically. Consider this, between 2005 and 2024, domestic passenger numbers grew more than 2 times faster than Brazil's population as a whole. During the same period, the average domestic ticket price has fallen 42%, from around 1,100 reais to 654 reais. 2 airlines called Gol and Azul have been at the forefront of this movement. Together, they operate to a pretty astounding 150 plus domestic airports and have captured around 60% of the domestic market. The other 40% mostly belongs to LATAM, a relic of legacy TAM's domestic dominance. I mean, at one point, TAM Brazil had almost 50% of the market following the collapse of VASP and Varig. Gol, for their part, grew quickly in the early 2000s and sort of plateaued at 30% market share. Now, they're encountering struggles of their own, and they were recently forced to restructure amid rising debt loads and delays in Boeing aircraft deliveries. Some speculated that a merger with Azul could be their way out of bankruptcy and a way to secure the long-term future of both airlines. Merger plans were announced in January of this year, and I'll admit, when the Brazilian government announced their support, I thought it would be a slam dunk. However, the deal still has to go through Brazil's antitrust tribunal, called CADE, and isn't expected to be reviewed until the first quarter of 2026. So Gol couldn't really afford to wait. As such, they secured $1.25 billion in new financing from 2 US investment firms, which will hopefully give them a little more breathing room to execute on their strategic plan, regardless of the merger outcome. Hold that thought though. Let's talk about Azul, because that's really what today's video is all about. Azul is a pretty fascinating story. Over a period of just 17 years, they've grown from nothing to over $3.5 billion in revenue. They've captured 30% of the domestic market, and they operate to 150 cities in Brazil, 3 times as many as their nearest competitor. They've brought the miracle of flight to people and places that have never had it before, accounting for 63% of all growth in the Brazilian market since 2007.
There were 46 million people flying by air in Brazil the year before we started flying. Today, this year, we will fly 30 million people all by ourselves.
In 2024, they surpassed the Gol as the largest airline headquartered in Brazil, completing their journey to the top in a sense, but if you ask them, they're just getting started. To understand Azul's true impact, we have to rewind the clock back to 2008. A man named David Neeleman had just been fired from his job at JetBlue, and this wasn't the type of guy to just sit around and collect unemployment checks. You see, Neeleman was the founder and CEO of JetBlue, and before that, he had founded 2 other successful airlines, Morris Air and WestJet. His first sale netted him $25 million in Southwest stock, and ever since then, he has been addicted to starting up new budget airlines. Now, even though Neeleman spent most of his life in America, he was actually born in Brazil. He lived there until he was 5 years old, and he's fluent in Portuguese.
I just always wanted to do something in Brazil. I always had this dream to come to Brazil, and there was so many people that were outside the economy. Brazil had one of the lowest per capita rates of air travel in the world for a country its size. So I thought, well, what greater way to introduce people to the economy than airfares.
When it came to naming the new airline, Neeleman wanted the Brazilian people to have a say.
So we did a little contest in Brazil when we had 148,000 names, suggestions that came out. And as we looked at them all, I looked at Azul and I said, wow, Azul, blue. So it was actually the second most voted on name anyways. The first was Samba. I thought that wasn't necessarily, just didn't seem to fit at 38,000 feet. So we named it Azul, and everyone's really happy with it.
With Azul, David Neeleman wanted to try his best to replicate the JetBlue playbook in Brazil. That means a few things, at least in my mind. First off, premium service at affordable prices. Second, a unique and defensible route network focused on connecting underserved cities.
This network is powerful. Over 150 cities, but look at these statistics here. We're the only carrier in 82% of our routes.
And then you obviously have cost management. Fly a fuel-efficient fleet tailored to your operation, configure those planes in a single-class layout, and keep marketing costs down. Oh, and lastly, maintain a responsible capital structure. If at all possible, don't drown yourself in debt. And that's somewhere they had an advantage from the beginning. Neeleman was already wealthy from JetBlue, and he was a good fundraiser, so Azul had no issue securing $200 million in startup capital. Early shareholders included a mix of American and Brazilian firms: Weston Presidio, TPG Growth, Gavea Investimentos, Grupo Bazzano, and Grupo Aguia Branca.
Well, we were the most highly capitalized startup in aviation history. You know, we had some very generous investors, and they put in $225 million of equity.
In their first year, they operated a fleet of just 5 Embraer E-Jets, 2 E190s, and 3 E195s. They financed around 3/4 of their aircraft acquisition costs through debt, but they got very favorable terms from the Brazilian development bank, BNDES. Why? Because they bought local. In terms of hubs, they avoided Sao Paulo's major airports of Guarulhos and Congonhas, and instead opted to plant their flag at Campinas, around 90 kilometers north of Sao Paulo.
Ele veio para Campinas, sim. Ele viu o aeroporto aqui. Ele falou, cara, eu acho que Campinas é o lugar onde nós temos que basear essa linha aérea. E nós chegamos lá, não tinha ninguém.
Nós chegamos no aeroporto, ele falou que isso vai ser todo nosso. Eu falei, cara, ninguém quer isso.
Eu fiquei impressionado, parecia um aeroporto fantasma.
Eu falei, cara, você acha que vai funcionar aqui? Ele falou, sim, vai. Tem gente que tem 5 milhões de pessoas que estão mais perto desse aeroporto do que qualquer outro.
The Campinas metropolitan area itself has 3 million inhabitants, bigger than Tampa, San Diego, Denver, and Orlando, and is located within 100 kilometers of about 26 million people. So as far as secondary airports are concerned, I'd say this is a pretty good one. From there, as well as Recife and Belo Horizonte, other big cities that were relatively underserved by Gol and Latam, they set out to build Brazil's largest domestic network. And growth came quickly. It took them just 8 months to hit the 1 million passenger mark, supposedly a record for any airline. In 2011, they started taking delivery of ATR 72s, perfect for the types of high-frequency, point-to-point regional missions Azul was trying to operate. The ATRs were also more fuel efficient, about 30% cheaper to operate than a comparably sized jet. By mid-2012, the carrier employed 5,000 people and was flying 55 planes to 50 domestic destinations. But that number was soon to double almost overnight as they acquired Brazil's largest regional airline at the time, Trip. It seemed like a match made in heaven. Trip had similar business model advantages, being the sole operator on 57% of its routes, but there wasn't a ton of route network overlap between the two airlines. Trip flew to a number of cities in north and central Brazil where Azul was not yet present. Additionally, Azul gained strategic landing rights at Guarulhos and Santo Dumont, which could complement existing operations at Campinas. And lastly, Trip operated an almost identical fleet to Azul consisting of ATRs and Embraer E-Jets, which made the integration of the two fleets and flight crews a heck of a lot easier. Once the merger was completed, Azul had the largest domestic network in Brazil, surpassing Gol and Latam. They also were the world's largest operator of ATR aircraft, with almost 60 of the type, which it doesn't matter too much, but I thought it was kind of a cool fact. Now, from a financial standpoint, they achieved profitability in 2011, but they recorded a slight loss in 2012 following the acquisition of Trip. Net debt had risen to around 2.6 billion reais, and the combined airline was generating around 467 million reais in EBITDA, meaning their leverage ratio is about 5.5 times. Pretty dang high. However, this is the airline industry we're talking about here. And at the time, Latam's leverage ratio was 7.5 and Gol's was 7.9. So by comparison, Azul was in a pretty good spot. But I'm getting distracted. After Azul and Trip joined forces, the combined carrier's market share was about 20%. Neeleman was on a tear. Sensing the momentum, he opportunistically filed for an IPO. They didn't necessarily need cash, but they wanted to accelerate their fleet growth and add new routes. Proceeds would also be used to pay down some debt and de-lever. As we all know from the various airline stories on this channel, successful IPOs are highly dependent on market conditions. Timing is critical, and come August 2013, the timing just wasn't right. Brazilian economic growth had slowed, inflation rates were high, and investors just weren't very bullish on Brazilian companies. So the IPO was shelved, and Azul marched on. In 2014, they entered the big leagues, if you will, launching long-haul flights to North America. The first destinations would be Orlando and Fort Lauderdale, two very popular leisure destinations for Brazilians, and two cities with large Brazilian-American populations. To operate these routes, Azul acquired 3 A330-200s and made plans to add an additional 5 A350s in the coming years. But that wasn't all. Azul also placed an order for 63 Airbus A320neos to operate higher density routes and domestic long-haul flights. The A320s would be a perfect complement to the E-Jet, giving Azul more seats and capacity that could be dedicated to strategic projects like Tudo Azul, Azul Viagens, and Azul Cargo. As part of this expansion, the carrier also launched its first premium products. The A330s would feature extra legroom economy seats as well as a proper business class with lie-flat seats. On domestic flights, passengers could now upgrade to Espaço Azul, extra legroom plus priority boarding. Azul's introduction of new cabins and unbundled products, along with the continued growth of cargo revenue and travel packages, drove massive increases in ancillary revenue. In 2012, the airline was generating 26 reais per passenger. 5 years later, that number had more than doubled to 53 reais per passenger. And that was before bag fees were even a thing. Until 2017, Brazilian airlines could not charge for checked luggage. ANAC, the Brazilian equivalent of the FAA, didn't allow it. They still can't charge for carry-ons unless it exceeds a certain size and/or weight limit. And that's a perfect example of how the rules and regulations can vary pretty wildly depending on where you travel, and more broadly, each region has a very unique story when it comes to aviation. And when I'm making these super in-depth videos, it can be sometimes a little difficult to get all the facts straight. That, combined with the fact I sometimes have to translate materials from their original languages, means that this is very far from Smithsonian quality work. But rest assured, I am trying to double and sometimes triple check all the facts. And just a quick glimpse into how the sausage is made here. It's not really rocket science, just a lot of time in a very cluttered looking studio, combing through news articles, research papers, and investor materials. And as you all know, before I publish videos on each respective airline or market or region, I try to actually fly there first, or fly the airline. However, I'm realizing that sometimes the best source of information is you guys. For example, if you live and work in Brazil, there's a high likelihood that you're probably a better expert on Brazilian aviation than I am. That's just a long-winded way of saying I have a lot to learn from you guys. Hit me up on my website if you want to connect, and I'll try my best to reach out, especially if I'm visiting your city or country. As a token of my appreciation, everyone who submits their info on my website will be entered to win a $50 gift card to the airline of your choosing. And I'll be drawing one winner at the end of the month. I did 2 for March, so congrats to the winners, Brendan and Travis. Appreciate you guys, thanks for the support, and let's get back to the video. As Azul became more sophisticated as an airline, they started getting serious about code shares and partnerships. These partnerships would allow Azul to expand its connectivity through the US, Europe, and Asia without having to commit full resources of its own. Tudo Azul, the company's loyalty program, all of a sudden became a lot more valuable, given members could now earn and redeem miles on other airlines. And it became the fastest growing program in Brazil, more than tripling in size between 2013 and 2017. Unlike Gol's, Smiles, and Latam's and Multiplus, Azul owned 100% of its loyalty program and benefited from 100% of its cash flows. The most significant partnerships, at least in my mind, were United, Hainan Airlines, and TAP Portugal. United invested $100 million in Azul for 5% of the company in 2015, later increasing its stake to 8%. The two carriers have cooperated closely to this day, selling flights through each other's websites, integrating ticketing and baggage systems for seamless connections, and allowing guests to earn and redeem miles on each other's flights. Hainan Airlines is also an investor through the now bankrupt Chinese conglomerate HNA Group. The Chinese paid $450 million for 24% of the company in 2017, becoming Azul's single largest shareholder. Now let's get to TAP Portugal, and this is where things get a little complicated, so bear with me. Using some of the proceeds from the Chinese, Azul turned around and invested 90 million euros into TAP Portugal through a convertible bond worth up to 41% of TAP's outstanding equity. Simultaneously, Neilman himself acquired TAP Portugal from the Portuguese government through a consortium he had formed with a Portuguese businessman. Now, Neilman's involvement in and of itself wasn't illegal, but the way the airline was bought was highly controversial. You see, Neilman's consortium, called Atlantic Gateway, got $226 million in financing from Airbus to acquire TAP. Then, once the deal was complete, TAP turned around and purchased 53 Airbus planes at supposedly above market prices. This deal resulted in a net cash outflow for TAP, leading to accusations that Atlantic Gateway used TAP's own money to acquire the airline. Neilman has called these accusations absurd and points to the fact that under his ownership, TAP's liquidity grew by 500 million euros, debt to EBITDA more than halved, and passenger numbers increased 54%. Now, whether something fraudulent actually happened, I don't know, but between the years of 2015 and 2020, Azul and TAP were very financially and operationally intertwined. The C-suite of TAP Portugal was comprised almost exclusively of former Azul employees. When travel demand in Brazil dropped in 2015 and 2016, Azul subleased 17 aircraft to TAP, both widebody and narrowbody. TAP helped Azul better compete in the Brazil to Europe market, together surpassing LATAM in terms of weekly flights. However, COVID changed everything. TAP was renationalized following a €3 billion capital injection by the Portuguese government, and Neilman and Azul had to sell their equity stake. We'll return to TAP in a moment, but let's rewind back to 2017 when the time was finally right for an IPO. Azul went public in both Brazil and the US, raising about $645 million to expand its operation and pay down debt. Importantly, the offering consisted entirely of preferred shares, which would receive dividends but not voting rights. As such, Mr. Neilman would remain in control of the company. Remember, when he gave up control of JetBlue, he ultimately was pushed out, and he wasn't going to let that happen again, at least for the time being. In early 2018, Azul was valued at around $3.2 billion, 50% more than GOL, who was still getting back on its feet following a 2015 restructure. LATAM was doing better owing to their scale and geographic diversity, plus a $600 million investment from the Qataris, but they still weren't without their challenges. Their fleet was aging and in major need of retrofits, and their cargo business was still recovering from a brutal regional slump that wiped out more than 40% of its revenues over the past 5 years. All this is to say that there still wasn't a clear winner in the Brazilian market, so Azul had an opening, and the proceeds from the IPO enabled them to really go on the offensive. As more A320neos started coming in, they swapped out the older E195s on longer routes like Campinas to Salvador and started seeing massive improvements in unit profitability, as the A320neos provided 56 additional seats at virtually no additional cost. They boosted frequencies from Campinas and Belo Horizonte while establishing a new hub in Recife, strategically connecting Brazil's northeast capitals and serving as a new launch point to the US and eventually Europe. When Avianca Brazil went bankrupt in 2018, Azul was arguably the largest beneficiary, receiving 15 slot pairs at Congonhas. This enabled it to serve the Ponte Aérea, the air bridge between Sao Paulo and Rio, for the first time. It's a highly competitive route, yes, but it was a fantastic marketing opportunity for Azul. They swooped in with free drinks, snacks, and live seatback TV, all at competitive fares, bringing new travelers into the Azul fold and causing a serious headache for the LATAM GOL duopoly. And look, it never was and never will be a core part of their strategy to fly out of Congonhas and Santo Dumont, but it has enabled them to capture a very lucrative part of the market, corporate travel. Brazilian businesses spend over $1 billion a year on airfares alone, and Azul was able to capture about a third of that by the end of 2019, which is pretty impressive given their business model and relatively recent entry into the market. Speaking of the business model, they were still a budget airline, but they didn't want to lose the premium traveler. Their service to overseas markets was turning out to be a huge advantage, so they doubled down, adding 5 A330s between 2019 and 2020, bringing the total long-haul fleet to 12. But these weren't just any A330s. These were the A330neos, and Azul was the very first airline in the Americas to receive them, and they didn't waste any time deploying them to their top international destinations, Orlando and Lisbon. There were rumors that New York and Paris were also in the cards, But then COVID hit. Azul made swift and sharp reductions to their flying, enabling them to preserve cash, and they made a big deal out of the fact they were the only airline in the Americas to maintain liquidity throughout the year without raising outside cash. Neeleman and his team viewed the COVID crisis as an opportunity, both to demonstrate the power of their network to lift Brazil out of the pandemic and to create new revenue opportunities that would continue to benefit the company long after COVID was over. One of those opportunities was cargo. They leveraged their network to deliver PPE and vaccines to some of the most remote areas in Brazil, but that was a temporary COVID thing, and they did that for free. E-commerce is where the money was, and no one else could reach the communities they had access to at the speed they could. Azul could reach 2,000 communities in 48 hours or less, a massive time savings compared to the road, which averaged about 7 to 10 days. Additionally, they had plentiful cargo space available in the bellies of their aircraft. They estimated that their cargo compartment load factor was 50%, and that was before accounting for new aircraft with bigger bellies and some of the cargo conversions. So they set up a bona fide end-to-end logistics operation, even opening up brick-and-mortar Azul Cargo Express stores, kind of like UPS and FedEx, where you could just drop off and pick up packages. They signed a deal with Amazon to speed up deliveries to the north of Brazil, specifically Manaus and Belém. So as a result of all these things, cargo revenue more than doubled between 2019 and 2024, and now they're arguably the most successful logistics provider in Brazil, serving over 90% of the population and delivering more than 10 million packages per year.
Before we got there and you ordered something online, it'd take you 2 weeks to get it. And now we get it to 4,800 communities in 48 hours or less.
There are other so-called beyond the metal business units. Azul Fidelidade and Azul Viagens also performed well and helped buffer the blow from losses on traditional passenger ticket sales. But don't get me wrong, it was still tough times, and without any government support or Chapter 11 protection, Azul still had to take some pretty extraordinary measures to ensure the future health of its business. They rolled over debt, renegotiated lease terms with lessors, deferred aircraft deliveries, and cut payroll costs drastically with the voluntary unpaid leave program. Since EBITDA had fallen dramatically, their leverage ratio rose to 11 times, but they were able to negotiate relatively good terms on their debt, lower rates than competitors, and a more favorable amortization schedule, meaning they wouldn't have to drain their cash on interest payments or debt repayment, at least in the short term. Come mid-2021, they had 5.5 billion reais in immediate liquidity, more than double Latam and 3 times Gol, who were both in bankruptcy protection, by the way. In November of 2021, Azul straight up offered to buy Latam, and not just Latam Brazil, the entire Latam group. This combined airline would have controlled half of all South American capacity, a South American mega airline, if you will, and Latam's creditors were behind it. Azul estimated it could create $4 billion in synergies, leading Latam's creditors to get way more of their money back than in the standalone recovery plan. However, the two companies just couldn't agree on a valuation, and they ultimately went their separate ways. Fast forward 3 years, and ironically, the tables have turned a little bit. Latam is now in a position of strength, with less debt, a streamlined cost structure, and a dominant presence in one of the fastest growing continents in the world. Azul, for its part, had a challenging 2024. On the operational side, they were impacted by aircraft delivery delays and floods in Porto Alegre that kept the airport closed for months. On the financial side, their EBITDA grew a respectable 16% to 6 billion reais, but they got absolutely crushed in what we call below-the-line expenses. Interest payments on both debt and aircraft leases had risen to 4.8 billion reais. Then, foreign exchange fluctuations drained another 7.9 billion out of the bank account. The result was a net loss of 9.2 billion reais. Not good. However, during the year, they also restructured, converting some debt to equity, renegotiating lease terms, and reducing costs. So their cash flow for the year was only slightly negative, and entering 2025, they still had 3 billion in immediate liquidity with a lower debt load. So what's next? Well, I don't think Azul is going away anytime soon. They've shown remarkable resilience and determination over the years, battling recessions, competition, and a pandemic. And every time they get knocked down, they seem to get right back up. Their network, their fleet, and their people will continue to be an asset for them, as well as their loyalty program, their cargo division, and vacations business. Also, despite its growth over the past 2 decades, Brazil continues to be a massively nascent market for air travel. To reach similar levels of flights per capita to Mexico, the country would need to more than double its passenger capacity, and Azul is well positioned to benefit directly from that trend. Plus, you still have the possibility of an Azul-GOL merger. And whether you're for it or against it, you gotta admit, it would be pretty cool to see another Brazilian mega airline take shape. But what do you guys think? Have you flown Azul? What do you think are their chances for long-term success in the Brazilian market? Let me know in the comments. Thanks again for joining me today, and I wish you the safest and happiest of travels wherever your journeys may take you. So long.